Welcome everyone. Now we're moving on to our presentations from the Community Housing Regulatory Authority, and dare I say it, it's double trouble today with Martin Farmer and John Bolsover. So Martin I did introduce yesterday, and I think I let everybody know the depth of experience that Martin brings to the authority in terms of his mahi on supporting to develop the regulatory framework, and then also on the operational side as well on delivering it to communities and to community housing providers. So welcome to you both, and I will pass over to Martin, who is going to be sharing about the management performance standard today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Morena, ko Martin Farmer toku ingoa. It's great to be back, Jen, and to be discussing this next part of the performance standards with you. I'll be speaking a little bit about the management performance standards, but I'm very much second fiddle to John today because he will be talking about the financial viability performance standards, which, as you know, are a critical component of the assessment of applications for registration. Before I begin though, I'd just like to mihi out to Christian. What an absolutely fantastic presentation that was. As I approach my 50th year on the planet, it is great to know that the younger generation very much do have these things in hand. And I'd just like to touch on a couple of things that he said in his presentations. Yesterday I spoke about governance and the need to provide a strategic plan for the entity that's becoming registered, and as part of that it should show an understanding of housing demand in the area, of operations. And I think that, you know, Christian's presentation showed a really encyclopedic understanding of that housing demand in the rohi. He spoke about the separation of services, which I'll be speaking a little bit about in the management performance standards, and the need for long-term planning. Social housing, one of the key aspects of what we do as a regulatory authority is give assurance that organisations will be viable over the long term. Social housing is a long-term game. Some of the people who are in public housing hopefully can move out of public housing and along the housing continuum at a time which suits them. But for some people, there will always be a need for social housing. So we want to ensure that registered providers are around for the long term. He spoke about, you know, don't overthink it, don't try and be the best in class. You know, we absolutely want organisations to put their best foot forward, but he did land on a really good point there. Regulation and registration is about a minimum set of performance standards. So it's a kite that providers, once they're in, then they can access various funding opportunities. So put your best foot forward, but don't overthink the applications, as Christian advised. So excellent. Thanks again for that, Christian. It was fascinating for me to see the other side of that equation from the applicant's perspective. So I'll move on now to the management slides. So you'll see down the bottom of that slide that this presentation was going to be given by Grace Hentelis-Devery. Unfortunately, Grace is not well today. Hopefully it's not this awful COVID thing that's going around at the moment. I'll be stepping in for Grace today. And just before I get started, a word about Grace. She's one of our senior regulatory advisors and a really valued member of our team. She has an accounting background, and before John came on board, Grace was the authority's financial advisor. So she assessed all of the audited financial statements that we received from applicants and also as part of annual monitoring. So there are 4 management performance standards, and which you must be thrilled about after yesterday's governance marathon. I will provide further information on each of these, but essentially what they are is there's performance standard 2A, that the provider must have appropriate accountability measures in place in respect of decision making and service delivery. 2B, that outcomes for tenants are measured in regard to affordability, access to information and access to services. 2D, that there is an appropriate organisational structure and systems in place to achieve business outcomes. That will all sound a little bit confusing and a bit of a word salad at the moment, but I'll go through each, like I said, in a bit more detail in the next few slides, so you'll know what you need to provide. But if you strip all the wordiness out of them, what we're assessing with each of these is what you see on the screen right now, and that's we're looking for accountability policies and procedures, that outcomes for tenants are measured, and that there is an organisational structure in place and systems to support that. Now, I said that there were 4 management performance standards, but there are only 3 listed on this slide. That's because one of the more management performance standards we do not currently assess as part of the application process. The one that we don't assess is Performance Standard 2C, and that states that a provider must be able to demonstrate that Crown funding provided for housing services is used for the provision of tenancy services. And we can't assess that until a provider achieves registration, because until they achieve registration, they can't access the IRRS. And until they access the IRRS, we can't tell how they're using that. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but we do assess that particular standard as part of our annual monitoring once a provider is registered. And all we look for is that income-related rent subsidy income is stated separately in the audited financial statements, either in the income statement or in the accompanying notes to the financial statements. So it's a fairly easy standard to meet. Now, I'll just go through the standards that we do assess at the time of registration. The first of these is 2A, and that's about accountability measures. And there are 2 components to meeting that performance standard. And you'll need to provide a decision-making framework and policies. Specifically, we require a delegations policy, and that includes a delegations schedule. The schedule can cover the schedule will need to cover financial expenditure delegations. So that is who can spend money on specific things, to what limits, and any sign-off that's required as part of that. And it can also should also include both capital and operating expenditure. And the delegation schedule should also include non-financial matters. It's up to you, depending on the scale and size of your organisation, what non-financial matters you include in there. But it's such things as who can make recruitment decisions, and things like who can speak about the organisation in the media on behalf of the organisation. So that's one component of what we require. And the other is policies that include regular management reviews and reporting to the board by management. So that's essentially regular reporting that happens at board meetings, and it will include things like the CEO's report, the finance report, and any ad hoc reports that are required. So, for example, if your organisation's undertaking a particular development and that needs ad hoc reporting to the board, there should be some policies around how that happens. And the second thing we require under these performance standards is measuring outcomes for tenants. And we look specifically at 3 different aspects of measuring outcomes for tenants. We look at affordability, we look at access to information, and we look at access to services. Under affordability, you'll need to provide rent setting policies to us that are designed to ensure that rent levels are monitored and reviewed by management. There's a slight balancing act to be achieved in ensuring rents must remain affordable to the tenant group, while at the same time maintaining the financial viability of the organisation. If you have more than one tenure type, for example, income-related rent subsidy and affordable rental tenancies, we'd look to see that you had separate policies and procedures for setting rent levels in respect of both. So for IRRS tenancies, that would be a contractual process with HUD's funding team that would be covered in that, but we would expect to see some outline of how rent is set in respect of those properties. And if you offer affordable rental housing as well, we would expect you to have a system and process in place for determining what is an affordable rent. And the usual way of doing that would be to use MB's bond data, or another way would be a desktop review of rents for similar properties in that particular area by going on, for example, Trade Me, and doing some sort of desktop exercise. But you should have a policy around how that exercise is done to make sure that it's done in a consistent manner and regularly reviewed by management. The second component is access to information, and what we expect to see there is that you have policies which require regular review of the types of information that are provided to tenants, usually through, for example, the tenant handbook. And policies should also include monitoring provisions to make sure that the information provided to tenants remains useful to them. So, for example, in the tenant handbook, and there is some overlap in this management section between what we require and what we require later on in tenancy management. But we do require that you do look at that information that you provide to tenants to make sure it's still relevant. So, for example, there's been a number of changes to the Residential Tenancies Act in respect of the types of amenities that have to be available and smoke alarms, that sort of thing. And we would expect to see, as those new requirements come online, that they're included in the information that's provided to tenants. And the final component is access to services. So the applicant will have policies for directing and referring tenants to find support services to help sustain their tenancy. And those support services can be things like budgeting, mental health services, etc. And policies should help tenants to access support, but not to influence tenants' choice of support services. If an applicant offers support services as part of its wider operations, the authority expects to see an appropriate separation between the provision of those housing services and any other support services that are offered. That separation is required to protect you and tenants, and we have a guidance note about it on our website if you do require any further information on that. And so I just thought I'd show a little bit more about what the separation means in practice. What we expect to see is that there's no blurring of housing and other services. So, for example, there should not be a requirement in a tenancy agreement that requires a tenant to accept support services. And there should not be any obligation on tenants to accept support services in exchange for the housing that they're receiving. The sole question should be for a housing provider, does this tenant have a housing need? And if so, that's it. The focus is on a need for the home. And the community housing provider is then links tenants to appropriate support services, either internally through another part of the organisation or to external support services. And the organisational structure that you have in place should support that separation. And we realise we've received a lot of feedback on this. So I am really interested to hear your comments and questions in respect of this, that it can be a bit alarming, especially to Māori providers who are invested in the overall well-being of whānau in the houses. And this might also be a good one for Christian, if he's still there, to come on and comment about whether he found that separation of services requirement quite onerous in preparing his application. But please be aware that we're not saying that you can't offer support services and housing services, but that you just need to be a bit careful about how you do so. This is a slide that Fiona Fitzgerald spoke to at the last wānanga that we gave, and it shows how a family-centred approach can be achieved. And by family-centred, I mean how support services can be offered through a registered CHIP in addition to housing services. So in this slide, the registered CHIP is the green L shape in the top right-hand corner, and it offers both housing and support services. But what that slide's designed to show is that there's a clear separation between the housing services and the support services. And in this case, the CHIP offers education and employment services. So the housing services part of the business only provides tenancy management and property and asset management. And these two sides of the business do not share personal tenant information between them. Also, you can see that from the housing business down to the whānau in the house, there is a tenancy agreement, and that's just for the housing services. There cannot be any provisions in the tenancy agreement that the tenant must accept support services as a condition of the tenancy. And the benefit of doing this it this way is that firstly, it keeps you safe in respect of various pieces of legislation. So for example, the Health and Disability Commissioners Code has a specific provision which says tenants must be free to choose their support services and who they accept support services from. And also, from our perspective as a regulatory authority, one of our legislated functions is to ensure that tenants are appropriately housed. And by doing it this way, the whānau in the house retain their authority to determine how they live within the laws of Aotearoa New Zealand. So we do consider it really quite important. So the next performance standard is having in place an appropriate organisational structure and policies for achieving business outcomes. So to ensure that the operational needs of the business can be met and intended outcomes achieved, applicants are expected to provide evidence that they have a clear organisational structure. And in a moment, in one of my last slides, I will show you what an organisational structure, what we sort of expect from that in respect of the supporting documentation for applications. And associated with that, role descriptions for the housing specific roles from the CE down to tenancy managers. And we expect that also that the structure and the policies must align so that the roles stated in the organisational structure must align with the responsibilities set out in various policies and procedures. And this is where we sometimes see a mismatch going on. And the reason is we'll get an application from someone who has borrowed policies and procedures from another organisation, which is totally fine. We encourage you to share knowledge and etc., so long as, of course, that the provider you've borrowed it from has given you their permission to use it, but that policy hasn't been adapted to your particular organisation. So we'll receive an organisational structure chart on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's policies and procedures that don't refer to the roles within that organisational chart. So they do need to match up. And finally, we need to see that there are systems to support operational activities. And what we're particularly looking for here is what sort of information management system do you have in place for tenancy and property management? Again, this will be something that is it needs to be entirely appropriate to the scale of your organisation. If you're a small provider, you will not have a dedicated tenancy management system like Shintaro. There is no need for you to go to that expense to acquire something like that. If you've only got a few properties, a simple spreadsheet will be fine. And so that's what we require under the organisational structure management performance standard. So that's an example of what you need to provide in terms of demonstrating the organisational structure of your organisation. It's really quite simple. It doesn't have to be overly complex. And as those purple boxes indicate, we do require role descriptions for those roles that are in the housing space. The other benefit for doing it this way is that it makes it easier for us to see the organisational separation in place between housing services and any other support services that exist. So as Christian said, keeping it simple is the best way forward in respect of this. So if you've got any questions, these are the slides that show our contact details. Look, thank you everybody so much for letting me speak, and best of luck with your applications.
Thank you, Martin. Kia ora. That was great, and a great oversight of management. The management one is quite interesting, I've always found, because when you look at one, it's there's a standard in there that you don't need to worry about in your application, which is always nice to hear. But also quite a few of those you could take care of under other performance standards, like the accountability one could come in under some of the documents prepared for governance, and those tenancy measurements could be shown in under tenancy management. So just wondering if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Yes, You're absolutely right, particularly about things like, particularly about the ones that fall under tenancy management, for example, and we do also look at various aspects of them there. I guess what we're looking at specifically under the management performance standards in terms of affordability, etc., is the review process by which management has oversight of affordability, and it is factored into the planning. It is balanced against organisational imperatives and things like that. So we do look at affordability under management, and we also look at affordability under the tenancy management performance standards, for example.
Yes. And it also lets you know that the crossover between the information of the performance standards. So you don't need to go and think, oh, I've already done this in governance, but now I have to come up with something completely new and different.
That's a really good point. Excellent. Thank you for raising that, Jen, because it's really important. If you've got a affordability policy which covers all the bases we need, we will use that same policy and assess it under management and also under tenancy management. We do not want organisations jumping through hoops and producing additional documentation that they won't be using in their businesses and which is an annoying pain for them to produce. We want documentation that is clearly set out, which covers all the bases and which is useful for them in running their businesses. So thanks for bringing that up.
You're welcome. And then we see, just in terms of wanting to pick up a little bit more on the separation of support services. And I notice in chat that Geneva has put in some of their reasoning as well, in terms of how they understood that separation from other parts of their charitable arms. And I really like the other two reasons that she's given, is that in terms of the setup cost for the CHIP, didn't want that coming from our charitable arms or them to have any associated risk. And also the importance of having choice for whānau and acknowledging that some whānau are whakamā to be using iwi services and that they would want that choice to be able to go elsewhere. But the reason why Martin did spend a bit of time on it is because it is part of a kōrero from some registered CHPs who are wanting to raise this with the authority and talk about it in a bit more depth. And so just wanting to put out there to the rōpū, if there are any pātai that you have or any kōrero on this part, we're just going to pause here for a moment and allow you to come in and ask any pātai or say your part. Kia ora, Thalia.
Kia ora, Jen. Kia ora koutou katoa. As the kaingaroa kaiarahi for Te Roroa, one of the key areas that I did want to ask is that, you know, we are about to enter into, you know, the infrastructure for our social arm. So we are a settled iwi in the Waipawa forest. Our rohe actually ranges from all the way from Tukatuka, Maunga or Dargaville sort of Ruawai area all the way across the Kaipara, Waipawa, South Hokianga into Araituru, so almost into Omapere as well. So it's actually quite a big territory, but I guess from a structural perspective, what I wanted to ask is that it's probably very similar to what Geneva is talking about. We were looking to, you know, create an entity under our social arm, but it is actually going to be a separate entity under social housing. Would that be the best way to approach our structure and infrastructure, or could it possibly come under the whole social entity per se and have a separate unit, I guess, under the social entity itself? So I hope I'm making myself clear there. This is all quite new to us as well. So to give you a heads up, Te Roro is actually in a space where we are co-creating a social entity for social services, for support services. And as an example, our COVID-19 team will be placed under our social services arm. You know, would it be pertinent for our housing unit, per se, to be a separate entity of itself or within that social entity overall?
Excellent. Look, thank you for that question. It's a great question. We would recommend that you do have a separate entity for your, yes, for your social housing, to keep it entirely separate, and that really does protect you and ensure that there is no unintended crossover between the delivery of housing services and the delivery of support services. 2 points that Geneva raised are both excellent points. And we do look to see that you'd need to have separate financial statements for the housing arm, which is always beneficial for us for our assessment. And you don't, because housing's a long-term game, we want to see that the housing arm is viable in its own way. So health service contracts and support service contracts tend to be shorter in duration, say 1 to 3 years, whereas housing, the need for that exists over a far longer time frame. So we get very nervous if we do see housing being propped up by income from other activities. So it is always best to separate it entirely and have it under its own entity.
Ka Taea, thank you for that. I'm just going to lead on to one more question then, in terms of what you're saying there. With, you know, the current assessments as they stand, because our housing, okay, I'm just going to let you know, Te Roro actually has 19 houses. We are by default a social housing unit already. So this was part of our treaty settlement handback. Most of our whānau are our tenants, and so of course by default our rental is already you know, at the lower end, much lower end. You know, we're actually looking to move those assets because they, you know, through an imposed structure, I must say, from the government, the structure we had to come up with was a commercial one. These are not commercial houses. They need to be moved across, and I can speak with conviction and I've been mandated to speak with conviction on our social housing side of things. They need to move across into a social housing structure. Is there any way that your organisation can help us, you know, to move or transition these houses into a full-blown social housing organisation or entity? Because there are a lot of complexities when it comes to treaty settlement handbacks where houses are involved. And I would dare say we are not the only iwi that have come across this. Have you created any pathways for other iwi to move these assets across into their social housing new entity?
We don't personally. As a regulatory authority, we exist solely for the purpose of registration and monitoring providers against those performance standards. I'm just wondering though, and Michelle or John, if you could speak to this as well, is there something to do with our TKKO team where they would have some resource available to assist in that? Sorry.
We do have other providers that have done this. We obviously aren't able to discuss what they've done or how they've done it, but it's not an unfamiliar scenario. There are some issues associated with it. As Marty just said, TKKO would probably be a really good source of advice, but we would be happy to talk privately about it too. It's very individual. Your circumstances could be quite different from some others. So I wouldn't want to say more than that really. Yep, we can probably help, but others can help too. Yes.
I would also add to that in terms of TKKO's ability to help. They would be a great source of advice. I'm not sure about other assistance that they could provide, but I do understand that they may be placed to provide other assistance when it comes to that as well.
Definitely consult.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you can get in touch with us afterwards, and we can try and progress this a little bit with you.
And from a financial perspective, we do understand a lot of these organisations are not-for-profit organisations and have arrangements in place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to a certain degree, you do need to be commercially viable over a period of time. It's good for your whānau and your organisation. But we do understand that you're not for profit in many instances.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have one more question, which is coming from Robert, and then we'll be moving over to John's presentation on financial viability. Kia ora, Robert.
Kia ora, Jen. Hey, Marty. So just it's a related question to the kōrero we've been having. So Tauhara North No. 2 Trust has created a subsidiary, Tauhara North Kāinga Limited. It's within the group. It's a subsidiary of the charitable company arm. And being a resource-based ahi whenua trust, the entity has significant commercial operations, and of course it's got its charitable arm as well. As an entity within the group, we get, of course, a lot of our administrative and management services from the group, you know, the finance team, HR, and I was just wondering, like, when we put in our application as Tauhara North Kāinga, do we actually have to have a whole lot of those policies around petty cash and HR, or can we rely on the group policies, or do we have to have service level agreements in place between the subsidiary and the parent?
Really good question.
You could do either of the second two.
Yeah, I was going to say you could probably do either of the second two. There might be scope for you as well to provide policies and procedures. Not all, I mean, and go through it. So a number of policies in respect of petty cash, etc. We don't need to see those policies. It's not to do with the performance standards, where we don't want to get weighed down in assessing those. In respect of policies that are more significant, that are located elsewhere in the group structure, the back office, finance policies, etc. There could be a couple of ways to do it, and one of those, for example, could be if we received those policies and they were in the name of whatever entity within the group structure they're in, but we had a letter from the parent organisation saying that it agreed to gift you the use of those policies, that would be fine as well.
Ka Taea.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for that, Martin.